Good evening, everyone. I'm Scott Buren, the project coordinator, one of two project coordinators for the J. Sherwood McGinnis Junior War, Peace, and Justice Project. I'd like to welcome everybody tonight. This is our second session for Transforming Conflict, and I would like to offer that you can follow us on warpeacejustice.org. As I mentioned to two ladies and gentlemen who arrived, this is our last event for the month of September. We'll begin again on the 25th of October with moral injury featuring Leo Quinlan, the son of Commandant Patrick Quinlan, who led the Irish Company during 1961 UN operation in the Congo. A fascinating discussion. I've heard it twice, and it should be enlightening. And that's on moral injury, collective moral injury. And then we also have, on the 31st of October, Racism and War, Double Victory, another fascinating event. Both of those venues will be held at Dickinson College. Again, if you follow us on warpeacejustice.org for times and locations, we'd love to have you attend. And please share that with your family, friends, and neighbors as well. War has a tremendous cost, a human toll, not just on our young men and women who serve in uniform, but also on the indigenous population. And tonight's about how we can transform conflict to reduce the risk to men, material, equipment, and especially the innocence in those countries that operations are taking place. Without any further ado, I would also like to ask everybody to silence their cell phones at this time. And I would like to introduce our moderator for the evening, Colonel Bill Flavin. Bill? I'm Bill Flavin. Thank you for coming. We're going to be looking at how institutions like the UN try to transform conflict and build peace. We have a distinguished panel here for us tonight.
Thomas T.J. Moffett, first up here, Department of the Army Civilian Deputy Director of the Army's Peacekeeping and Stability Operations Institute at Carlisle Barracks. Retired Army Colonel, served in the infantry and a European Foreign Affairs officer, served in various commands from EUCOM headquarters, served Defense Cooperation in Sarajevo and Athens, commander of the U.S. Military Observers Group in Washington, and a course director for the Army Strategic Educational Program and Transitional Courses, and was the Director of Security for the Navy Support Systems Command. Lisa Charlin from Australia, the Senior Fellow and Director of Protecting Civilians in Conflict at Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. She was previously the Deputy Director of Defense Strategy and National Security and the head of the International Program of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute in Canberra. Lisa served as the Defense Policy Advisor at the Permanent Mission of Australia to the United Nations in New York, where she provided advice on peacekeeping and defense-related policy issues and represented Australia in multinational negotiations. She has worked in numerous international fora and possesses a deep knowledge of various countries in crisis. Dr. Ivan Alunga is the Associate Professor of Political Science and International Relations at Salve Regina in Rhode Island. Apart from academia, he has also worked intensively with international organizations, think tanks, NGOs, business consulting firms, microfinance institutions, and small businesses in investment and risk in fragile states and conflict regions. His recent book is Humanitarianism and Security, Trouble and Hope at the Heart of Africa. And Tom Matioc, the Executive Director of the Joint Civil-Military Interaction Network, Senior Lecturer in Conflict Analysis and Resolution at Middle State Georgia University. I now hand this over to Mr. T.J. Moffett.
Thanks, Bill. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our second panel discussion. Before we start, I want to say that all of my opinions are my own. They do not represent the position or the policies of the Department of Defense or the U.S. government. So to start with, I'd like to talk a little bit about last night and an analogy that Dr. Matioc used about pointillism to define conflict. So in that, he said that the image of conflict is made up of many brush dots. When you zoom down into the brush dots, you see all the elements of the conflict, and it helps you understand the image that you see when you are looking from a distance. So in other words, each data point, when joined together, creates a unique picture that helps us understand the conflict. And I apologize if that oversimplifies what you said. So that was at the local level. Tonight we're talking national, multinational organization level. So for me, I think the pointillism analogy still works, but instead of an image like Monet's the picnic that we talked about last night, I think it's more like a Clarence Rorschach test. Because when you look at that image, everyone has a different interpretation of what that is. So whether it's a national perception or a multinational organization looking at it, they have to determine what is that image they're looking at, even though the data points may all be the same. And I think that's what makes the role of those organizations and governments much harder, because there's so many different actors that impact on how they will respond to conflict and move from conflict to peace. And the other thing that we talked about last night that we had a hard time doing was defining the word conflict. So I'm not going to define that definitively tonight. I guess that's, but generally speaking, for the purpose I think tonight, we'll say that it's crisis, conflict, instability, maybe fragile states. It's not necessarily a war going on between two factions. It can be a lot of things that cause instability. Because we're talking transformation, and we're talking that period from conflict to peace. And you saw in the video, there's a big question mark at the end of the word peace, because that's also a difficult term to define. So hopefully in our discussion of transformation, it'll give a better understanding of both of those terms, but how do we move from one to the other? So the first person that we're going to have is Lisa Charlin, and she's going to be talking to us about transformation within the United Nations.
Great, thanks TJ, and thanks again for the invitation this evening, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion tonight. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of the UN in this context, and I think the video that we saw earlier this evening here provided a bit of a snapshot of one of probably the best known reflections of what the UN does on the ground, and that is UN peacekeeping, or those that serve under the blue helmets. But before I go into that a little bit, I wanted to take a bit of a step back, because I think at the moment it is a bit of an inflection point for the UN, or I feel like it probably is on a weekly basis, particularly the UN Security Council, when it comes to its role in our discussions about conflict transformation and peace and security. I think it's sometimes helpful, and I've had a few people raise this with me in the last few weeks. We've just had, in the last 2 weeks, we've had what we call UN Leaders Week, where you see all the heads of state go to New York, deliver their speeches from the podium. It's probably the busiest week for anyone who works in a diplomatic mission in New York. And a lot of talking takes place, and I think some people would sometimes contend limited action. But the reason I wanted to kind of zoom back to that sort of macro level of looking at what the UN does as an institution is I think it's important to reflect back that this institution has been around for 75 plus years, coming out of the ashes of World War II, which in itself obviously had a huge transformative impact on the way that the world and countries in it saw themselves, and also how they go about resolving conflict. So we had these institutions set up. We had the UN Security Council established, the UN General Assembly, a range of other bodies, and a lot of them have a really important role when it comes to considering the international response that we mobilise in these situations. And in a way, people look to the UN, and I guess it as an institution, in terms of providing a degree of legitimacy when it comes to international interventions that take place. And that's why it's often seen as such an important venue to make sure that these discussions are occurring in. And that has had mixed results over the last 7 decades or so. We've seen, throughout the Cold War, the Security Council was largely sidelined. We've seen where the Security Council has been in agreement. We've seen multinational operations deploy, thinking back to the situation with Iraq and Kuwait in the first Gulf War in 1991 with the authorisation there. Not a UN peacekeeping mission, but the deployment of international forces into that context. We saw the same in the context in Libya in 2011 when there was a Security Council resolution. Although it was not unanimous on that occasion, there were some abstentions. And I think it'll be left for those assessing that conflict in terms of where that goes following that international intervention. But nonetheless, this is the body that is equipped with maintaining international peace and security. What we see now in the debate around the role of the Security Council in these responses to conflict and its role here is, what is the response to conflict when those permanent members, that is the UK, the US, France, China and Russia, are not in agreement about what should occur. And of course, I don't need to tell anyone in the room here that this is sort of the situation that we find ourselves in with Ukraine. And so hence I tie this back to the discussions over the last 2 weeks that have been taking place in New York, because there has been a lot of discussion around, well, how do we reform some of these institutions if need be, which has been an ongoing conversation since their establishment. So that's the very macro question around, are these institutions fit for purpose in terms of what we're looking at? And in that case of the debate around Ukraine, we have seen efforts to circumnavigate that, look at other options, look at other approaches. Does the General Assembly have a role? What can we do on accountability? How do we hold different stakeholders to account, and so on? But I think this also comes back to a question about what are the expectations of the international community when civilians are under threat in particular. And I think when we're talking about those different definitions of what we're talking about with conflict, situations where civilians are under threat of violence or there's a risk of mass atrocities, I think are things that really strike our consciousness when it comes to what we're looking at in terms of an institutional response to those situations. And again, this is where I think the role of the UN over the last 70 years has been really important and probably poorly understood in some situations, because often you do hear the stories of where things have not gone so well, as opposed to a lot of the daily work that happens and is ongoing across the globe. So that's the very strategic level. I wanted to touch briefly on the operational because I think it's helpful to have a little bit of consideration for the different tools that are at the disposal of the international community. Peacekeeping is one I will go into a little bit in a moment, and one that is very well known. What is less well known, of course, I think, is the fact that a lot of the work that does take place is with significant international support and agreement day to day. Humanitarian response, efforts by the World Food Programme, efforts by country teams providing development assistance in the country, those that may be emerging from conflict or coming out of different conflict situations. And these all often take place in terms of a spectrum, in terms of the level of engagement, depending on how severe a crisis may be. The same applies when we look at the context of the tool like peacekeeping. Now, peacekeeping was not something that was referenced in the UN Charter, of course, but nonetheless has become an indispensable part of the way that the UN, as an institution, responds to countries that are in crises or where there is a conflict that is in need of attention. And again, that takes place on a spectrum. You've had in the early days of when UN peacekeeping started deploying, these observe, monitor, report missions, and that was sort of their idea. They deployed, generally unarmed, to observe on what was happening and provide that sort of interposition between two different groups. These days, it looks like a very different scenario, and we saw that in the video before, these multidimensional missions, which number in the tens of thousands, that deploy military, police, civilians, with mandates to protect the civilian population, with mandates to support peace building, rule of law, security sector reform, disarmament, demobilisation and reintegration of forces that may be armed. The list goes on. It is extensive and it is complex. But that speaks to the volume of, I think, the way that we look at conflict is that it's not just an endeavour in terms of trying to prevent or mitigate some of the different harms that may take place on the ground, but really an endeavour by the international community to help in building institutions and building resilience to concerns that there will be conflict in the future. So we see that sort of play out in the way that the UN has engaged, and what is really pivotal here when we're having a conversation about, I think, conflict transformation, is what is the political will behind that effort? And that is often the challenge for a tool such as UN peacekeeping, is sometimes the political will is lacking. And that is why we have seen a huge divide in the countries that are willing to provide personnel to deploy to these missions and those perhaps that are willing to fund these missions, which may be something for further discussion. And similarly, the resources. And we saw there some figures about how cost-effective peacekeeping is when you compare that to military spending around the globe and what it delivers on the ground. So I think a lot to unpack there and look at. But briefly, just before handing back to you, TJ, I wanted to highlight, I guess, a couple of the challenges that we see in the space where the organisation I work in has been involved in research around some of these issues, because I think it's important in terms of how we frame this discussion around conflict transformation. We see, for instance, that there's an evolving range of threats to civilians. They're not just coming necessarily from the threat of armed groups or terrorist organisations or even different state authorities. We see the threats that are being posed by the environment, for instance, when it comes to climate security and the role that that plays in stoking concerns and conflict on the ground. We see a challenge, and this is a particular area of research we're engaged in at the moment, of what does the relationship look like when you have an international force like the UN that deploys to a country at the invitation of the government, but then the government that has invited them looks to put obstacles in the way of how they operate. So this might be in the range of status of forces agreement violations. It might be in the denial of visas to personnel coming into the country. So what does that look like at a more operational and tactical level when some of these, efforts are going on to transform conflict a little bit? And I think really importantly, what does the mismatch of expectations look like for those that are on the ground affected by conflict that we heard so much from Ivan yesterday about, that expect, one, that may have their own efforts to resolve conflict and different issues that are causing concern in terms of their security. But what does that actually mean then in terms of what they expect of the international community or the regional organisations that come in? What is the mismatch there in terms of what they're going to be able to do and be able to achieve? So I think I will finish on a note that I think is very pertinent to the UN conversation tonight when talking about it as an institution here, and a quote that would be very well known to a lot of people in this room, of course, from the second UN Secretary General, Dag Hammarskjöld, that the UN was not created to take mankind to heaven, but to save humanity from hell. And if we're talking about expectation management, I think that is, we can aspire to obviously a lot more than that, but I think it's mindful to say that, there is a lot of good work that is done by the UN as an institution, not necessarily living up to all the expectations we have, but a very important role when it comes to talking about conflict transformation. So I'll leave it there.
Lisa, thank you. We're now going to turn to Yvonne. Yvonne's going to talk to us about the African Union.
Thank you, TJ, and Good evening, everyone. Again, I have to say thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to engage in this important conversation. And as I said yesterday, I would want to also say today, maybe this talk is not about providing solutions, but because if I had all of these solutions, I'll be traveling the world and then say fix A and B and then the world will be at peace. but I guess we are more focusing on critical reflections on what can be done and what is going on and where should we go from here. Lisa mentioned, and I'll focus on the UN, United Nations, in trying to narrate in the region. A few years ago, I was watching an interesting TV show on Netflix. I'm not doing an ad on it, but it was called The Scandal. And I think it was a very interesting scandal. And one of the most important thing for me was how the team, or that law firm was called. They were called the fixers. So if there is crisis, they will call Oliver Pope and they will go fix everything. And talking about fixers, there is this expectations as well when we think of international conflict and security, where we look for fixers. Who could fix insecurity and instability in Mali? Who should be the fixer of a conflict in the Congo? Who should be the fixer of humanitarian crisis in South Sudan? So we look for fixers to the point that we miss the understanding on what these fixers are supposed to do or are called to do. And this is an ongoing issue with the African Union. Everyone says the African Union should be able to address issues of insecurity and instability in Africa. Yes, it is a great call, but let's go back to the root of this organization and then see if they were, or if the organization was called to fix this issue and what is the ongoing trend in their operations and what are the alternatives that we are seeing on the continent now and which can be considered as effective approach. So I will touch probably 4 key points quickly. The first one is just to lay at least the overview of the situation within the context of the African Union as an institution. And then I'll touch quickly on some strategic responses that have been seen and observed. And then we'll finish with challenges and opportunities, and then I'll touch what are the challenges and what is probably the current opportunity that one can embrace to address these issues of insecurity through the African Union and as well as other sub-regional organizations. First, the institutional context and challenges that the African Union faces. It is important to understand that the organization itself, as a continental organization, experiences an issue of organizational harmony. In other words, they still struggle to have a single definition of the agenda for peace within the institution. And this is critical because, as I think TJ said earlier, and it was also mentioned in the movie or in the videos, that peace came as with a question mark. So if we don't, first of all, agree on what peace is, how can we define and develop an agenda that will bring about peace? So this is one of the things that we see within the African Union, is how do we harmonize our views in order to define peace and therefore develop the agenda for peace and raise the right resources for what we would consider to be peace. So that is the first thing within the institution of the African Union. And of course, the agenda for peace at this point is not only being developed or trying to be developed at the level of continent, but there is also regional organizations such as the East African communities, the SADC and the West African community, all of them trying to define peace in support to the effort of African Union. And here I will move probably quickly to the second institutional concern within the African Union and in collaboration with regional organizations. The difficulty is that the African Union cannot define peace and outsource strategies from regional organizations and then say, well, if it's a crisis which is in the Sahel region, an organization within the Sahel region should define and address peace and will provide some support. But the issue is most of these organizations were not framed to be at the center of security provision. Most of them, actually I would say all the regional organizations that we have on the continent were framed, created to promote economic cooperation. So their primary goal is economic growth, economic cooperation. How do you then expect these organizations with economic lens and development goals to be security providers? How do they pull in resources? What type of training is supposed to be generated from within? This is kind of at a very institutional level. And the second element in the context is the growing influence, external influence that the African Union is receiving in terms of defining its operational goals and activities. One is the external influence from outside forces in terms of defining governance system. The case of Libya is one of them. And I know we'll probably get involved and talk about it a little bit more, but I want to touch Libya and Zimbabwe. Libya was one of those cases. The country was technically stable, using normal metrics. It was stable, no violence, but of course, when you use the metrics of governance, it was under dictatorship. So we had to change the trend, and then we think of democratization, and then we have Libya today as a completely unstable country. So that is one of the external pressures put on the African Union. How do you deal with this call for democratization within the continent where democracy is not always the to-go governance system that people need? The second country I say I will touch is Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe, after Mugabe had issues with the British, the country was under sanction. And sanctions, economic sanctions led to a massive migration. People from Zimbabwe moved to South Africa. And what we had there, it was another humanitarian crisis created within the sub-region of Africa based on the call for quote-unquote transparency and governance and democracy that was supposed to be promoted in Zimbabwe. And all these were happening against the will of major actors within the African Union. And this speaks to the external nature of external pressure that the continent or the continental organization keeps having when we think of governance. The second dimension of the pressure is at the security level. Suddenly we have a counter-terrorism call. 9/11 happened here. We securitized activities around the world, and one of them becomes the counter-terrorism call. Somehow everything that is happening in the Sahel, Niger, Mali, and the French sent the Balkan troops, and pushing national government to rethink their security priorities. Instead of, for instance, reforming their troop training, we start rethinking on the terrorism lens. How do we do counter-terrorism operations, which are not technically the priority of most of these African countries? And today Mali is in a crisis, and Niger and other places. I'm not saying there is no terrorist organizations. There is a growing ideological wave of changes within these places. But the security concern was not always that of shifting from traditional security practices to counter-terrorism operations. And the African Union faces that issue of how do we adapt, how do we change, and how do we engage in this new narrative, because most of the resources are allocated to that type of operation. And many countries struggle with that. And I'm not only talking about at the national level. We have a private security contractors operating there. And one of them in Central African Republic is the Wagner, Russian security contractors. We have them in Mozambique. We had them in Mozambique. So you have not only influence of outside forces in terms of government entities, but somehow the security condition is also influenced by a private sector who are coming in as contractors, getting money and doing the operations. How do you promote an acceptable and safe security environment where the rule of law is accepted and respected, where we know that the terms of engagement of these actors differs? They are not always aligning themselves with what the African Union think is acceptable. This is another pressure on external influence. And now, go quickly to strategic responses, and then of course we'll probably get back into discussion on some of these points. Strategic responses, one is that the African Union is outsourcing security or the means of security. And here I want to be a little bit provocative on the point that Lisa said, outsourcing security through peacekeeping, because countries cannot do it. Now we have peacekeepers who have to come and then quote unquote provide security. And when we realize that they have been on the ground for 20 years without providing, it becomes frustration. And then, so we outsource security or the means of security, but without enjoying the benefit of peace. So that becomes another dynamic in terms of strategy, which is a negative strategy, I will call it that way. And second, in terms of strategy, is that I said it earlier, relying on regional economic organizations for security purposes. The SADC cannot provide security to a country. The East African Community cannot provide security based on their constitutional act and the aim and goals and type of resources that they have. It's more economic cooperation. And even the African Union was not created to be a security organization. The Constitutional Act was that of making it an institution that will facilitate cooperation and unity within African countries post-colonization. So it wasn't aimed to address security issues, but it was mostly aimed to increase unity and collaboration. So that also is another difficult thing to address. And I will handle with challenges and opportunity. One challenge is the challenge of adaptation. How do you adapt as an economic organization, a governance organization? How do you adapt to this changing nature of security and conflict when you don't have the right means? And in opportunity, I think we need, as within the continent, to broaden the security response and conversation. Understand that the issue is not only military. Security and insecurity are tied to issues of economic, cultural, and political dynamics. And all these are some of the areas that we can look into, saying if we cannot talk about investing in formal military services, let's minimize the risk of violence by investing probably in the economic aspect, in cultural aspect, because most of these conflicts are multidimensional, but the responses are often single-oriented to security concern. So this is a little bit kind of a scope on what African Union is experiencing as pressure and the type of responses. Are they being effective? That is another question to be discussed. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Yvonne. So now we move on to Tom, who's going to talk about NATO.
And I join my colleagues in thanking you for this opportunity to speak with you this evening for a few minutes regarding the challenges that NATO is facing today. For more than 70 years, NATO has kept the peace. Within NATO, that peace continues even as war is raging on its eastern flank. Commitment of the NATO nations to maintaining peace and security is going through its biggest test ever. Civilian and military stakeholders are working to manage crises that are threatening the alliance and developing new tools to mitigate those threats by strengthening individual and collective resilience. The Joint Civil-Military Interaction Research and Education Network is part of this effort. The continuation of peace in Europe is regularly linked to Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, the commitment of its members based on an acceptance that an attack on one will be seen as an attack on all. But equally important is Article 3, that calls on all member states, individually through self-help and collectively by mutual aid, to develop and maintain their capacity to resist armed violence. Individual and collective resilience are crucial to comprehensive and total defense. The Warsaw Institute, in its special report, 4 Challenges for NATO 2030, identified an existing list of challenges. The rise of China, disruptive technologies, terrorism, the South, arms control and nuclear deterrence, energy security, climate change, human security and women, pandemics and natural disasters, hybrid and cyber threats, outer space, strategic communications, public diplomacy, and tackling disinformation. And every time I read that list, I think it's time to throw in the towel and say it's just too much. But I go on. And these are the risks we know of. Hungarian NATO liaison Colonel Emir Porkolov and Ben Zweibelson at Joint Special Operations University suggest that added to the known knowns are the black swans that shatter any illusion of stability or extension of normalcy in foreign affairs. NATO is challenged with an unending cascade of known and unknown challenges for which traditional planning and organizing methodologies are inadequate. Different approaches to crises are demanded. Yesterday evening, I spoke to this need when I suggested conflict transformation needs to supplant conflict resolution and take on a collective approach to security and defense. Andrei Yermak, President Volodymyr Zelensky's chief of staff, noted in an Atlantic Council interview that today's security architecture is dead, and those who are not able to grasp it are simply blind. Fabrice Potier of the International Institute for Strategic Studies argues that Russia's attack on Ukraine in February this year has made NATO take its traditional territorial defense responsibilities seriously. NATO members who had agreed in 2002 and reaffirmed at the Wales Conference in 2014 following Russia's annexation of Crimea and attack on the Donbass to commit 2% of GDP to defense has taken on a new urgency. Certainly Germany is taking a lead position with the alliance by recommitting to its defense spending. But money is not the only nor the biggest challenge. Learning to work as a loose network, flexible and adaptable, will continue to challenge NATO bureaucracy. Different ways of thinking and decision-making are critical to meeting the ongoing and future challenges where complexity and uncertainty seem to be the norm. As we move forward in this geopolitical environment, we recognize how Europe has now 3 options. A federalist approach that fully integrates European defense with an EU framework, a transatlantic framework that views NATO as the one and only place for European defense, and third, an intergovernmental model that bypasses collective structures to defense and works in ad hoc coalitions. In April of this year, NATO published its new strategic concept outlining the way forward for the Euro-Atlantic Alliance regarding defense, crisis prevention and management, and cooperative security within a contested security order. NATO identifies strategic competition, pervasive instability, and recurrent shocks as defining the broader security environment. Challenges to NATO in a newly evolving security architecture include Russia's annexation of Crimea, the 2014 attack into the Donbass, and the 2022 invasion of Ukraine proper, all of which have presented an emerging set of challenges. Some of those are new generation warfare as practiced by Russia using chemical-grade weapons for targeted assassination, cyber attacks, disinformation, and election meddling, and continue on to military shows of force. Russian and Chinese disinformation campaigns are a new challenge for NATO countries. Russia is using a digital playbook while NATO is all analog. An over-restrictive bureaucracy coupled to a cumbersome consensus decision-making structure disables the alliance and prevents it from taking bold responses to unconventional attacks. NATO's greatest challenge may be how it maintains a credible collective defense structure when threats cut across military and civilian domains. Other threats that we see facing NATO today: authoritarian actors challenge collective security interests, values, and democratic way of life. Increased nationalism threatens collective security initiatives. Terrorism continues and remains the most direct asymmetric threat to the citizens of NATO countries. Pervasive instability resulting from human trafficking and irregular migration remains a significant challenge. Human beings are continuing to be weaponized and employed strategically to destabilize society. The People's Republic of China looks to control key technological and industrial sectors, critical infrastructure, and strategic materials and supply chains. Cyberspace remains a contested domain, as does the degradation of our space capabilities. Erosion of the arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation architecture. And finally, climate change continues to be a challenge to NATO, requiring the alliance to adjust its capabilities to engage in extreme climate conditions. Not specifically identified as a threat to NATO, but clearly present is the disturbing fact that democracies around the world are in decline and authoritarians are on the rise. As a political organization, NATO is confronted with authoritarian leaders, and in recent elections in France, the far right made significant gains. Before the invasion of Ukraine, there was much concern with the degradation of rights in Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, all NATO countries. Now, of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has done much to solidify NATO, too. The situation on the eastern flank motivated governments to pay more attention to their defense budgets. Budgets have mostly been fixed at higher levels. That said, a challenge facing NATO is reform of defense plans. Looking at the war in Ukraine, we observe clearly the need for civil-military interaction, interoperability, and integration. Trained and organized civil experts are a game changer in war amongst the people. And the civil population is absolutely necessary to collective, comprehensive, total, and open defense strategies. The Joint Civil-Military Interaction Network was developed to address this challenge by constructing a framework for civil society, military, government, and academia to engage in dialogue regarding human security and resilience. And I invite all to be a part of JCMI and the work we do, as well as the work that my colleagues are here, because it truly is a collective activity. And I echo the comments made by my colleagues as well, that we simply cannot outsource our security. That the threats we are facing today are going to require grassroots, ground-level work by citizens who have to take on a deeper role in providing their own security and not simply outsourcing it to others. So, thank you very much.
Thanks, Tom. So that brings us to me. Now, one of the things that this has been very fascinating, listening to these multinational organizations, regional organizations, and their perspectives. So I hope I don't derail the conversation, because now we're going to talk about the United States a little bit. And unlike a multinational organization, you would think that we're more unified in our decision-making, but our decision-making is different. Our decision-making is based on national security objectives and our priorities. And ultimately, there's one person at the top who's going to make that call as to whether or not it is a priority. And that depends on the perspectives of that individual and their approach to the world order, international relations, what the United States needs as a country. I think that's important because unlike the General Assembly, the Security Council, the African Union's governing bodies, and even the NATO headquarters and North Atlantic Council, we ultimately in the end are speaking with one voice. There should be one voice or one action. I think that is where, for the United States, the National Security Council has to determine, does a conflict raise to the level of a U.S. priority? And if it doesn't, how do we leverage one of these other organizations to maybe intervene or get involved, or how do we support them to do that? And that's a very difficult decision to make when you consider all the domestic issues that the president, the administration is also looking at and trying to balance, okay, we have issues in our own country, which one of these countries really matters enough that if it gets really bad, it's going to make life bad for us. So the priorities have to be based on what's the effect on us as the United States. When we do that, we look at what are the organizations within the U.S. government that would handle this. Now, I want to step back a second and talk about transformation, because I think the term that we would probably use is stabilization. When we look at the Department of State, U.S. Agency for International Development, Department of Defense, and other agencies that support those efforts, we don't usually talk about transformation. Now, the Stabilization Assistance Review that we did in 2018 between the 3Ds, development, diplomacy, and defense, the Stability Assistance Review, the SAR, it did talk about transformation, but it used it in terms of stabilizing an area in order to transform it. And so in that, they took a look at Afghanistan, looked at Iraq, looked at all of the stabilization efforts of the last 2 decades. And I think that it's important to understand it. Let's go back in time to 2001 and what were the U.S. priorities in 2001 prior to 9/11. Where did conflict transformation fit in there? We were focused on the Balkans at the time, so we did have a close relationship with the United Nations and with NATO in terms of trying to stabilize the Balkans. It wasn't large-scale reconstruction, large-scale nation building. It wasn't what stabilization or transformation became in that 2-decade period. If we have to look at why did it become such a big event? Why did it become such a struggle for us when we have such a huge amount of money to throw to the problem, the resources we have? Why in Iraq did it not succeed? Why in Afghanistan did it not succeed? Why did we have to leave both places when we did? And if you look at it, transformation, stabilization, there's a period after the battle is won. So defense comes in, defense fights the war, they declare victory, and then they want to turn it over to state. So the SAR, the review, clearly aligns the Department of State as the lead agency for stabilization. The U.S. Agency for International Development is the lead implementer, and Department of Defense is there in support. Even though we're that 800-pound gorilla in the room with the money and the resources, it's their show. We talk about defining things. The SAR, the 3Ds came up with a definition for stabilization, which I think is important. If you can't define conflict, you can't define peace, then let's talk about the process. And it's a political endeavor. And even in defense agreed to that. And now it's codified. So even within Department of Defense, we have our DoD directive, the Department of Defense Directive 3000.05, that codifies stabilization as a political endeavor. Now, there's more to it than that, and maybe if I get to my notes, because now I've deviated from my notes completely. But we also have on Joint Publication 3.07, Joint Stability Activities, we've incorporated it there. So part of the SAR was to institutionalize multiple different parts of stabilization so that we had a unified approach to it. Now, that was taken from some strategic failures and lessons learned. So I'll go back to Iraq circa 2005. So maybe even a little bit earlier than that, because 2005 is about when we realized, okay, this is what we need to now take a different approach. But the military went in, declared victory very quickly, and was prepared to turn it over to State Department, but State Department was not prepared to take it over. Now, if you think about it, there's about 2 million people, military and civilian, active duty in the Department of Defense. 2 million. State Department, including their approximately 50,000 local national employees in each of the countries, has about 76,000 people. 26,000 are Americans, and of those, about 8,000 are foreign service officers. So 8,000 foreign service officers working in embassies around the world. Suddenly, you have this organization that has a budget that's less than 10% of the Department of Defense is now expected, and a culture that's not used to deploying into combat or conflicted zones to support these activities, is suddenly called upon to create a government, to create a police force, because Department of Defense does not do policing. That's a State Department task. So all these things that State Department is now required to do, but they don't have the resources, the doctrine, the planning, the ability to really carry it out. So you have a period in there between 2003 and 2005 where we're constantly trying to figure that out. And so those lessons from that time period were really crucial to us understanding that. One of the lessons, we need to develop an expeditionary workforce, a workforce that when the battle is won, is ready to go to work in support of or with the military in support of them. We need to look at police forces. NATO has a concept for stability policing that the U.S. has not yet embraced. We haven't dismissed it. It hasn't risen to the level of approval or disapproval, but this concept for stability policing takes that point where the military has won the war, but needs to continue assisting because there's not enough police forces out there, police trainers. So the military, as the military decreases, the policing is increasing and police trainers are increasing. So the military kind of weans itself, or the local police wean themselves off of the military support and actually lean more on civilian institutions until ultimately they can take over. And so when we try to define peace, we talk about local governance, and the SAR kind of comes to that conclusion. So we can't define peace, I think, at the beginning. We can't come out of conflict or instability and say, well, this is what it, and maybe in some cases, if it's a flood, maybe we know what does it mean to get back to normal after a flood or a humanitarian disaster. But in a conflict, what does it mean? So rather than define that, let's talk about the road to get to a normal sense of security. Reestablish a safe and secure environment, which in the Protection of Civilians reference guide that we have for the military, we talk about establishing a safe and secure environment. And what are the elements of that? Well, when we look at all the elements of that, which are security, territorial security, governance, there's about 5 or 6 different elements of it. When we look at those elements of establishing a safe and secure environment, that's the end state, is when you get to that point where people have some degree of, they have a legitimate government that is representing them, of local people. There's economy is improving. There's so many different elements of what a stable, secure environment is. And I think that's what our objective is. So when we look at State Department taking the lead now, they have advanced so far in the last 15 years in terms of being able to manage crises from a diplomatic perspective. And USAID, who forever has been operating in Africa in austere environments and doing those things, they now have a much greater relationship, and it goes both ways with Department of Defense, whereas sometimes that was a strained relationship prior to Afghanistan and Iraq. We've learned a lot about each other, and I think the SAR really goes into that when we talk about what the relationship is. And 20 years ago, all I could hear from my State Department colleagues in the embassies is like, hey, why can't you do that? Why can't defense do that? It's like, well, one, it's not our mission, but two, that's your job to do. Now it's like the conversation is more cooperative. It's between us to say, hey, we need to accomplish this. How do we do it? And I think that we've come light years there. Transitioning a little bit from that, there's other institutions. I want to come down into the Department of Defense a little bit, because the Department of Defense has been making some big strides also in terms of this transformation period. So we've learned a lot in terms of, and Colonel Liddick mentioned it last night, the civil affairs officers who are in amongst the people working with them. We've learned so much about what it means to be a force in a country trying to do the right things, trying to advance peace, stabilization. But now as we look back, there's some things that we could have done better. And a lot of it starts internally with the Department of Defense. So recently, 2017, the Women, Peace, and Security Act of 2017 that Congress passed and the President signed went into action. The next President put out an implementation plan, and the Department of Defense has taken that and is now instituting principles of women, peace, and security, which takes into consideration the role of women, children, and other groups on the battlefield, in conflict, in unstable regions, not only about the protection of them, but the involvement of them in their governance and in their military, in the efforts to improve the situation there. And almost on a weekly basis, we are involved over at PKSI with meetings on establishing a DoD instruction on women, peace, and security so that the services can then implement it. And not just implemented during military operations, but day to day, within our training, within our education, within our external example to other countries. So when we go out to train, if you have a task to train a military on how to assemble and disassemble a rifle, rather than have a male soldier do it, have a female soldier do it. And in a male-dominated society, that might have a significant influence to see a woman assemble and disassemble a rifle in faster time than they can do it. So there's a lot of different elements to it, but it's an important aspect of it. And it's not to be confused with diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's a different program. And the UN has had it for about 20 years. NATO's had it for 10. We're a little bit behind, but we're also the first country to have both a national action plan and a law that backs it up. So Secretary Austin has been very supportive of these programs, and we look forward to where they're going to go over the next year. The other one is a recent development, which is the Civilian Harm Mitigation and Response Action Plan. So if you hadn't heard about this is a significant development within DoD, supported by Secretary Austin, backed by congressional verbiage in the National Defense Authorization Act, which tells the Department of Defense, initially it was telling them everything to do, but Secretary Austin has taken such big steps that they backed off and just said, we will support this. And they're willing to support with money and resources as early as this fiscal year, starting on Saturday. So it's a big program. We're in the process of developing a DoD instruction for that as well. There was a team that looked at this problem from January to about May for Secretary Austin, sequestered down in just outside of Arlington, or the edge of Arlington, Virginia, and they developed this action plan. The Army's been tasked to be the joint proponent for civilian harm mitigation, and was also tasked to set up a Civilian Protection Center of Excellence, which is a very big deal, because we're looking at not just targeting in conflict areas, but all of the harm that could potentially be done by military operations and exercises. So these are steps that, as we look at conflict transformation, it's going to impact how do we operate in these countries overseas. So if we go to a country that has an unstable environment, it requires U.S. intervention of some sort, or humanitarian response even, not just an armed response, but a humanitarian response, we have to take into consideration these elements. And in the end, they're going to be critical parts of transformation, because we understand military operations. We study them ad nauseum from the day we come into the military to the day we retire. So we understand the military operations, we understand the tasks and the missions, but it's the nuances that we really need to learn, which is taking the different populations into consideration, the environment, the strategic environment, the different organizations that have influence there, both economic, military, whatever they might be. So at this time, I'm going to go ahead and transition to a discussion with the panel. I'm going to ask the panel a few questions. Hopefully we'll get a little dialogue going, and then we'll open it up to questions for the group here. So the first thing was that, I heard the word resilience. So Tom mentioned resilience, national resilience, organizational resilience. How does the African Union look at resilience in terms of the different conflicts that occur? So you mentioned economics in each of these places, that's one of the foundational problems more than security is the economics. But a big part of it is also the ability of the population to respond to changes, whether it's a negative or a positive change. How would you say that the African Union looks at the resilience of a population or a problem?
Yeah, thanks, Ajay. That's a great question. I was tempted to start by saying I don't think they look into it, and there is a reason for that. You have a big divide between the political narrative of resilience, and which is somehow connected to institutional function of countries and the organization. And on the other side, you have the social dynamic and the social concerns within which one can talk about resilience. So let me probably start with the local one. I think in context of conflict and violence, I've not yet seen around the world resilient people. I might be a little bit biased on that. I've not seen resilient people, such as the ones fleeing violence, resisting to violent conflict for more than 20 years, 5 years, moving from one place to another, adapting and surviving. And these are not seasonal. For some people, this is a daily reality. Living with the risk of moving from one village to another within 5 days or a night. And when we think about resilience, we don't often see the ability, or we don't learn it from the victim, if we can use that word. So when to the African Union, I would say African communities affected by violence are already resilient by the exposure to this type of conflict. But how do we maintain a level of resilience, probably adapting and surviving? The African Union as an institution has a wrong approach. I'm very critical of that. The idea of saying if we have a stable government, then we have a resilient institution, we have a resilient community, and we have a resilient country. A stable government may be a government that does not provide services. It might be a government that does not promote human rights and other principles. And it is still stable because we have one head of state who is not removed by a military coup. So if we have 5 years of non-military coup, okay, this country and institutions are being a little bit resilient to the shock and the waves. So this, I think, is the wrong indicators that I'm seeing are being promoted by the African Union. On the other side, I would say what should be done is the reflection on learning on what is being done by local communities who live without the acceptable minimum resources, and yet they can still survive and see tomorrow. And this is not codified in laws, it's not codified in policies, it's not codified in organization. And this is learned and I think codified in human daily interaction. And that where I think I would say the notion of resilience should come forth. But of course the African Union is trying to do the institutional approach, which is not always giving or projecting justice to local dynamics. Yeah.
So it's interesting because we talk about resilience, but we generally talk about it when there's a new conflict or a new issue. And you mentioned the long term, those who are under long-term effects of conflict, that they adapt, they move, they change. And So you wonder, is it learning from resilience, or is it resolve to accept the situation that they're in? I think there's a nuanced difference there, and how do you get that from I'm just resolved to this is how my life is going to be, as opposed to now that I've moved, I'm going to find a better life, as opposed to I need to be prepared to move again once the M23 moves into my area.
Yeah, I think it's more about the idea of saying not raising high expectations on the day of great peace, but living with the peace of being alive today and enjoying the moment. And once you enjoy the moment, if something greater than today's experience comes tomorrow, then yes, we embrace it. But again, I have to experience the joy of being alive today, and then having one book instead of 15 books in the classroom, having at least a teacher instead of not having a teacher. So those are, I think, realities not only on adaptation with expectation, but adaptation with acceptance, saying this is it, at least for now. If it hangs now, that's still fine. And I want probably to expand a little bit to say it's also more psychological than philosophical or policy oriented. So one of the things that is being missing in so many literature, I'm trying to wear a little bit the academic hat here, is that thing, when we talk about peace, we talk about stability, we talk about security, and then acceptable environment, we talk about the outside dynamic. And sometimes we forget to focus on the trauma and a personal trauma, the adaptation that people are having while knowing that I may live or not live tomorrow. So how do I frame my mind? How do I raise my family, my kid, in that context of uncertainty without considering economic indicators? So this is where I'm saying it's more about being confident of adjusting your mind, your feelings, and also trusting in the better days of good policies. But if those days don't come, at least you are okay with what you've done today.
That's great. Great response. And what a world that would be, huh? Tom or Lisa, do either of you want to add to the resilience conversation?
No, I think.
Okay. So well done. I have another question. So Lisa, this one's for you. So as the UN is reforming, we in the U.S. we go through the same process, and it is another element of our assistance review, the SAR. Assessing, monitoring, and evaluating success. How is the UN looking at that in terms of the missions that they have and could potentially have?
Where to begin with a question like that? I think it's certainly...
Well, you wouldn't answer my resilience questions.
Look, I think in terms of, there's a lot of different measures, and I think the first place to start with is the fact that, the UN is a political body. So when you are evaluating, I guess, how a mission is tracking, I wouldn't necessarily even use the term evaluating, because often there are political decisions being made about when a mission is deployed, when it is withdrawn. These are not necessarily based on indicators of success in terms of where a mission might be tracking and what sort of where measures will line up when it comes to are the institutions more resilient? Have we met some of our requirements when it comes to the mandate? Now, all those things do factor into the reporting that we have from the UN when it looks at what's happening on the ground, for instance. So you see in UN peacekeeping, for instance, they've developed over the last few years a comprehensive performance assessment system, CPAS, which they're trying to use and roll out to missions to assess across the board how they think they're tracking. And the constant question here is, are we sort of using the right questions, the right measures, the right indicators to see what effectively measures performance on the ground? There's a range of other tools to bring together that data and to look at what missions are doing. But there is an ongoing discussion, I think, really, and this is where I guess academics and the research community and others come into this conversation, to say, well, how do we measure whether or not the missions on the ground are being effective? Is it a case of, a number of us have been involved in research to try and look at some of the different factors. How do you assess it against the mandate a mission has been given, which outlines the different objectives that it's seeking to achieve on the ground? Are they necessarily the right ones? Because at the end of the day, that's been negotiated by 15 members of the Security Council and is a compromise document, which anyone who has read one of those documents, some of them number 15 plus pages, setting out exactly what the mission has to do, sometimes with minimal clarity because it's a politically compromised document. But nonetheless, you have the mandate. You then also have, I guess that then translates into different documents and policy and directives on the ground in terms of the way that the mission carries that out. So you can measure it against the mandate, but then I think there's a broader question about measuring it against the situation in the country and the drivers of the conflict, and to what extent has the mission been able to actually address some of those on the ground and have an ability to affect change. And that, I think, is sometimes a more difficult question when you're looking at how effective have some of these missions that the UN has deployed been when it comes to assessing sort of effectiveness and evaluating and monitoring. Often it's a case of drawing together a lot of quantitative material and sort of seeing, in the case of protecting civilians, it might be that this particular military unit went out and conducted X number of patrols this day and interacted with this number of people. Is that the right way of measuring whether or not the mission is having an impact on the ground when it comes to improving the way that those civilians actually feel about their own security on the ground? So I think this is an evolving discussion when it comes to the way that the UN looks at how effective these missions are. I think there is much more realisation that this is really critical, not only to ensuring that it delivers for those that are affected by conflict on the ground. It also plays back to the political masters when it comes to demonstrating, and I guess this plays into the US government side of things a bit, the utility of these missions and why they're a really good investment when it comes to delivering. And of course, you also have to compare that against the fact that there have been some really visible failures in terms of what some of these missions have been able to achieve in the past. And I think overcoming that, seeing what improvements have been made, are a really important part of that conversation that ties back into peacekeeping reform. So there are a few points. I think it is a bit of a mixed bag when it comes to looking at peacekeeping, but I think it's an ongoing question there to look at how effective have they been. At the end of the day, there is academic research that shows that peacekeeping missions have made a difference on the ground when it comes to minimising the threats against civilians, having an impact in terms of supporting peace in the country. And I think the more that research and that analysis is conducted, the stronger place we will be at the end of the day in terms of being able to measure, are these the right tools that we have available to us? And importantly, are they actually delivering for those that are affected by conflict on the ground?
Good answer for a tough question. So Tom, you get the next one. This one is I think it's relevant and current. So as you talked about the ability of NATO to one, gain consensus to achieve a mission or even to embark on a mission, what right now is NATO talking about in terms of conflict transformation in Ukraine? Can you talk to that at all as an example of some of the things that they're working on? Or
Well, CT, you jumped right into a question asking, I was waiting for you to ask me so I could jump in.
well, you know what? Before we go to that question, go ahead and because AM&E is a priority, I'd say, for all of us.
What you're talking about, I find it fascinating when we talk about certainly assessments and, of course, the political nature of UN missions. And I just brought a couple of things we talked about here and making notes and maybe trying to corral up some disjointed ideas. And one of them is that, yes, when we do talk about, and I guess I better say what I wanted to talk about, and that was the idea of not only are we talking about assessment, but when we talk about conflict around the world, we have to talk about what's getting our attention. Simply put, there are just more conflicts than we have the capacity to respond to. So conflicts are going to have to be prioritized. And some are going to get our attention and some are not going to get our attention. Some are, we just don't have the capacity, the resources, the energy, the time. And so I think that's important is to take a step back and say, okay, what's getting our attention as well? And that makes me think about this discussion about peace writ large. And again, we talked about it last night where we used the terms conflict and peace. I think it's important to add a little, the old saying, complexity is free. So we should add as much complexity in as we can because it's free. And that is, what piece are we talking about? Are we talking about a negative piece, or are we talking about a positive piece? Because we have a pretty good track record on the negative piece side, which we define primarily as the absence of direct violence. So we can get to a negative piece. But then I had the opportunity to speak with a scholar at risk from Rwanda. And he said, great job, guys. You left exactly when we needed you the most. Because you achieved the negative piece, but now we have a multi-generational issue that we have to deal with. Rape was used as a weapon of war. We now have one tribal member that isn't accepted into another, the child that doesn't belong to either group. We have issues that we never even thought about, and you guys took off. Because we never made it to the positive piece, which is the rule of law, just institutions, education, all those human security dynamics of not living in fear, of not living in hunger, of human dignity. That we don't touch those because, well, we got to go to the next conflict. And oh, by the way, they're tough. And they're going to just suck resources and time and energy for generations. And this is when I said conflict last night. I was talking about conflict. When it becomes a conflict, we're in for the long haul. It's going to dip and peaks and valleys, but it's going to intensify, it's going to decline, and so forth. And that made me think about one of the things I would love to do. My life would be completely successful if I could get the military to remove end state from the lexicon and replace it with next state. The issue is not to achieve an end state, but to move along the confrontation, the conflict, along to its next state, and then its next state, and its next state. And I think if we began to think like that, that we're not working toward an end state, we're working toward a next state that is a fundamentally better than where we're at today. And then take that as a net good, and then move on again and again and again, and accept that in this age of persistent conflict that is multi-generational, that we'll be training and educating our children and grandchildren as well to take these on. So I just wanted to say that because I think it's important that we talk about negative and positive peace, and we just don't let it go with peace, because I think then the real ditch digging of peace work is in the positive peace sector, which doesn't get a lot of publicity. It doesn't get a lot of movies made about it, but that's really where the payoff is. So I wanted to highlight that you.
That's a very, very interesting comments. I would say our definition of next state is Department of State. So right. You hit the military end state, but then the next state is Department of State. So, but no, I understand your comment, and sometimes the words do limit what we do, because everything ends at the end state. And so, no, it's an interesting perspective. So rather than go back to my question, and I'm going to open up to questions from the audience to see if anyone has a question that they would like to ask of any one of us.
Here you go, TJ. Darren Buss, I'm an Army officer in the area. First, thank you, both tonight and last night. Great discussion. My question is kind of for the whole panel, and it relates to organizational creation versus transformation. We all talked about the establishments of our associated organizations, many of them post-World War II, whether it's Department of Defense and the version we know it, the United Nations, NATO, and how those organizations have adapted over time as the mission sets and the challenges. And right now we're looking at adapting. Should we adapt or transform our organizations? Should we disestablish some international organizations? Should we create new ones? And while the African Union is newer, but you mentioned how it was economic based, but it's included security, whereas you have the European Union and another model. Has the African countries considered a similar thing as creating a separate security institution? So that's just kind of my question.
Yvonne, you want to start with the...
Well, I'll try. Yeah, I think that creation versus transformation is critical. And going back to creation, we have to say every organization was created based on certain international context. And the primary need was to address the imminent risk and situation. The UN, 1945-1948, that period, the need was that create this organization to promote international security and cooperation. And so that sense of collective security and order, that was the need at that point. Fewer countries, independent countries, existed at that time. Most African countries, for instance, and Latin American countries were still colonies. They were not independent, so they did not participate, for instance, in the phase of UN creation. 1960s, the claim of independence, so the adaptation to international system and the idea of joining the UN wasn't really about embracing the idea of the UN, but building more their political legitimacy. So we joined this club, we're independent, we accepted, but we don't know what they signed for. They did not sign for our peace, because they signed for Europe and Western peace. That was first the context. And of course, the UN went into the idea of transformation. And I think CJ touched it a little bit, this idea of, although it sounds like it's recent, but it's not very much recent, this type of idea of diversity and inclusion. It started by then, so well, how do we create a diverse UN body and include the voices of folks who are not participating in international politics as independent countries prior to the 1945 and 1960s. So it went on, it worked. The transformation helped at the level of international law and regulations of policies. And now we have the World Trade Organizations where all these countries join. But now, should we talk about I guess, if we have to continue talking about transformation of the UN, and then the UN parts to Lisa, but the transformation of the African Union, so we have to ask a very difficult question, transformation to what? So, is the African Union able to transform from a political organization to political/security/economic organization? And if that is the next step, what type of architecture do we need in terms of legal architecture and political architecture? And even what type of resources need to be put in? So I think, yes, transformation is key, but for the African Union, for me to summarize myself, I'll say one is adaptation. Because at least adaptation makes it easier to say we cannot be rigid in our traditional institutional model. So there is a new crisis, we adapt to it. We adapt to it. And by adapting, we are building a new institution and getting a new format of what we think will be and we should be, because we don't have a pre-established model that we're trying to get to. But by adapting, we are creating a new model that will be more relevant to the society and the environment. And probably the last thing on the African Union, if I had that the background of saying transformation, adaptation, or restarting something new, I would say let's restart something new. But the practice is that we cannot do that. We cannot dismantle the existing institution because it's linked to some functional, political, and administrative system, even though some of them don't appear like that. So I would say creation depends on the context. Transformation helped many countries to project at least an idea, but right now it's more of adaptation because the type of crisis, conflict, and insecurity are very much unpredictable. And either we prevent them by creating an environment which is safe, or we adapt to what comes as a surprise and keep being very much flexible in the model of preparedness.
I think with regards to, in the context of the UN, for instance, find it difficult to, if you got rid of that organisation, to create something similar today. I think most people acknowledge that, and the unique circumstances that it came out of were horrific. And in fact, early discussions around the creation of the UN, as many would know, were against the backdrop of what was happening in World War II. So with that in context, I think there's 2 points that are worth highlighting here. So I think there is scope for adaptation and reform. We have seen that in the institution over the last 7 years, but it moves at an incredibly slow pace. And so I think the point that Ivan made there, when the UN was formed, if I remember the number correctly, 51 plus countries were, 51 countries or so signed on originally and were involved in those negotiations. We now have 193 member states. So that's a huge growth. And as Ivan alluded to, a lot did not have a say at the table when that was taking place. So I think you saw, one of the things that was really striking about some of the statements that we saw coming out from Leaders Week, for instance, the Prime Minister of Barbados was talking about the importance of inclusivity in terms of these discussions and who's sitting at the table and who has a seat in these discussions. And I think a lot of that is particularly targeted at the Security Council, which is seen as a very exclusive entity, and one worth considering and focusing on a bit, given we are talking about conflict and peace and security here. So I think this concept of inclusivity, but also the second part related to that, legitimacy. And I think you started to see signals in the last few weeks, particularly from the US government, about the openness to the reform conversation when it came to the Council. Now, discussions about reform of the UN Security Council have been ongoing for decades. It has reformed in the past. It has grown in terms of, it was not the size it was today. It used to have 11 members, it now has 15. And so the Council has adapted as the size of the UN grew. There are so many different models that are on the table in that conversation. I'm not even going to go near them this evening. But I think this question of legitimacy is sort of a conversation that we're likely to see a little bit more of when it comes to discussions around reform, who has a seat at the table. And we do see in the Council context at least that a lot of the initiatives, while there's not formal reform per se, that the working methods of a body like that have adapted over the last few years. So for instance, the role of the African countries, certainly the A3 as they call them on the Security Council, and how they've utilised their voice collectively to involve in negotiations. Reform of the working methods, opening up some of those processes to elected members. So I think adaptation is really critical if organisations are going to remain relevant, and I think for a body like the UN, that is particularly important. But I don't think we're going to be able to start from scratch and start over again.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Imagining a new organization being created today is it's difficult to imagine that anywhere, although maybe Central Asia in the future could be something. But that's my opinion. But I know I work for a guy whose signature block says, if you don't like change, you'll like irrelevancy even less. And so adaptation is necessary. The change has to happen. And I think there's an important difference, though, between reform and adaptation. Because reform, I think, is much more challenging. Because I've seen change in adaptation in the UN and DRC when they started using remotely piloted vehicles. They don't like to use the word drone, but and not only did it help the UN, but it helped the NGOs. It helped with route reconnaissance and finding roads that were impassable. I mean, there were so many benefits that once you broke that logjam of no drones, because the US had created this image of drones that was very aggressive, very offensive minded. But once we broke that and said this is something that all the organizations can use, the intervention brigade, the use of an intervention brigade as a method to go out after armed groups, huge change for the UN, but one that when everyone gets the facts behind it, understands why it's necessary, and it's something that the Security Council can agree on, it's a good thing. Now reform, and you talked about it's reformed in the past, but if it's going to be, I think, ceding any kind of authority or ability to influence the way that they currently influence, I think that's a really tall order.
I don't see the P5 thing up as
Yeah. No, and that's where Security Council reform is going to have to be very creative, I think. So, Tom, did you want to add anything to that? Because here's something for NATO. 25 years ago, I was in graduate school, and the debate was, should NATO expand eastward? And there were a very strong group of people that said no, it absolutely should not. And this was the second expansion into the east. And then there were some that said, absolutely it should. So it sounds a lot like conversations that are happening again today. So within NATO, as we talk about reform and adaptation, do you think that it's an organization that has even less adaptation or reform? Or?
I believe that probably the structural nature of NATO is an organization that brings 30 independent sovereign states together to work together, shares much, I'm sure, the same challenges the EU as does the UN. Yeah, it's just going to be a challenge. I think your point is well made regarding NATO and moving to correct myself. I don't believe NATO moved to the east. I believe the east moved west, and NATO was not imposed with Eastern Bloc nations, former Soviet states, simply gravitated west. And so I don't know if that was, I question the narrative of NATO expansion, but that's fair. But what I would say, and I think is an interesting question, because we have to face it, Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine, February 2022 of this year, gave new life to NATO. NATO, since the fall of the Berlin Wall, has been wandering around looking for something to do and define itself. I mean, we talked in 1991, we started talking about the peace dividend, we started talking about, well, we can all saddle up and leave, life is good, rainbows and unicorns. And so France begins to talk about a European defense initiative, a European army, because NATO is obsolete. We've gone through all the Trump era, and we know that history. And so NATO is kind of struggling. I mean, what do we do? Do we have a job here? Are we really necessary? Then there was talk about, well, maybe NATO should look at missions in the Pacific. Does it have a role over there? We could do those things. So I think that was a legitimate, here was an organization that was originated post-World War II to maintain the peace. And then the need for that moves on, and now what do? Do we just pack our stuff up and sell the property, or do we go look for a new mission? And so Ukraine gave it that new mission. This is a long way of saying, and I think that has given it the impetus it needs to look at how it's going to adapt itself to this changing environment, this changing geopolitical space that it finds itself in. As I mentioned in my talk, because it's the NATO bureaucracy that warfare has now become fluid, it's become hybrid, it's become asymmetric, it's moving at the speed of light up against a NATO decision-making process that's bureaucratic and cumbersome. And it's making a decision about an event that happened way back there because the conflict has moved along so rapidly. So I think, yes, there will be reform. I don't see NATO going away, and nor do I believe it should. But I do believe it's going to be a hard, long slog. because like any other institution, it faces a lot of internal pushback. It's,
All right, thanks, Tom. Appreciate that. It's a good question. Scott?
Anybody else from the audience before I introduce?
Brad Wolf, I'm from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Much of the conversation seems to be about coming in after the fact, after conflict has already arisen, emphasis on peacekeeping rather than peacemaking. And I wonder if there's room for any benefit in having more discussion about how we take a look at what causes those conflicts in the first place. Because they're not born out of nothing. They come from either food insecurity, land insecurity, inequality, injustice, what have you. And if perhaps more emphasis were put on that kind of discussion, we wouldn't be trying to fix what is broken. It's much harder to fix something that's broken than trying to keep it from being broken in the first place. And so I don't know if the UN or NATO has room for that kind of discussion or adaptability, but it would certainly be beneficial when we hear things like you were mentioning DOD and State Department having a bureaucratic dispute about whose job it is to police in Iraq and Afghanistan. As that dispute was going on, hundreds and thousands of Iraqis and Afghans were dying. And so there are lies behind all of these words and disputes. And it's very important that we remember that and to reflect back and say, well, 20 years we were in Iraq and Afghanistan, and now we're undergoing some kind of security review to improve our mission. I mean, that's a horrendous mistake, a catastrophic loss that occurred. And I guess I'm I'm offended by just the sort of tone of some of the discussion when so many lives were lost. And I would hope that there could be more emphasis on peacemaking in the first place than just this sort of retroactive looking back in bureaucratic language.
Yeah, so I think that, and again, my opinion, when you look at Iraq and Afghanistan, you're talking about a completely different kind of conflict than one that is fairly predictable. That one that is, you see a drought happening, and you see fighting over food, and eventually local governance falling apart. So I think that there are efforts, and I'll let you talk about the organizations, but from the U.S. perspective, we're constantly watching those. In fact, from a military perspective, because this is what I'm more involved with than state and USAID, who I know look at those things from the development and economic perspective. But from a military perspective, we have now in the Army what are called Security Force Assistance Brigades. Those brigades are there to help legitimate governments as they are confronting instability, to try to prevent them from getting to a point of conflict. So we have what we call the conflict continuum now, which goes from competition, which is a steady state in the world, to crisis, to actual conflict, and then back down to competition. And our goal is to keep it at competition, not to elevate to crisis or conflict. So within the Department of Defense, we are looking at that because that's not where we want to go to. We don't want to get to that point of conflict. So what we can do within the mandate, the laws that govern the employment of the U.S. military is to work with those legitimate governments, those militaries, to help them try to diffuse and improve not only their capability, but their ability to reinforce confidence of their local population in their ability to provide a secure environment and hopefully return back to to competition. So Iraq and Afghanistan, we considered those a war and it occurred from specific events that happened, I won't say without warning, because there was a lot of talking going on beforehand, but it came to a point where the talk had to stop and it was decided that action was taken. So I think we learned a lot from how we interacted after the actual heavy combat fighting was done, but I'm not minimizing the loss of life. The mistakes that were made, the lessons that were learned from those mistakes are incredibly important moving forward. And that's one of the reasons why we see this new civilian harm mitigation and response action plan that's been implemented is to try and prevent those things from happening before they happen. So I'll pass that over to all of you.
I mean, on this point, I think absolutely yes, there needs to be more focus on how you address these situations before they rise to the state of conflict and intervening after conflict has broken out. I think part of the challenge, if you're looking at a UN context, for instance, is that the countries of concern that may have, there may be signs or indicators that conflict might be on the horizon, have to be open and willing to invite others in if that's what is seen as the best approach going forward. So whether it's for mediation, whether it's the role of a special political envoy, there still often, I think, is a bit of stigma attached to, certainly for countries that get on the Security Council, that can be a real concern and they don't want to be on the agenda of the Security Council. By then, they're probably already, conflict has escalated in most cases. So I think there's, but I think that the other point I'd make here is that a lot of this relates to how do we address what we know are some of the indicators or concerns for conflict early on. So, for instance, initiatives and work that go into through the UN Development Programme, to support investment in different institutions. The work to ensure countries are investing in efforts around the Sustainable Development Goals, for instance. The role of entities like the Peace Building Commission and others, although admittedly a lot of those are countries that we would perhaps classify as emerging from conflict. Efforts to invest in human rights and institution building. So I think all of these things, contribute to that picture, hopefully, to mitigate the risk that we're going to see countries lapse into conflict, and then we have to sort of deal with the emergency situation of going in if that's the best approach. But I think ultimately, at the end of the day, it is really hard to get attention that this is what is happening in a particular context. People are paying attention to the fires and the crises that are going on. But if there are warning signs or warning alarm bells going off that we kind of know from what we've seen in the past that this is going to be a context that we need to get engaged in, I think actually getting that attention, which the attention piece has been brought up today, is really hard in that sort of that prevention piece, in that effort to be a peacemaker. And so even though I think people are aware that there are concerns that need to be addressed, often it's getting the attention of others in the international community to say we actually need to invest some energy and effort in here. And if there's less interest in that context, it can be really hard to energise the organisation to do something. So that's sort of, it's not the best answer to your question, but I think most of us would agree that it's ideal to prevent this from happening in the first place. How do we get people to pay attention to that? I think is a really big challenge.
And I'd like to clarify that I don't think that there was a struggle between who had responsibility for police forces. I think that if you look at the U.S. military then and now, the U.S. military is not trained to do community policing, to do investigations, to do detention of criminals and that type of things. Even the military police are focused more on convoy security and traffic control, battlefield circulation, those kinds of things. So the military has never been trained as community policing people. They've never had that capability. And the Department of State has responsibility for that, but I don't think that we really expected the challenges of reestablishing a police force that they confronted. Whether it was policemen, for a myriad of reasons, policemen not coming back, policemen who were killed, policemen who, whatever reason, didn't come back. So they really had to reestablish a national police force. And how do you do that? And so it's something now, yeah, it's a tough lesson for us to learn. And we learned it in a really bad way. But it wasn't as if nothing was happening, because there were efforts. There were police trainers that came in, and efforts were made. And my best friend growing up went over there he's a police officer. He went over to be a police trainer in a small village in Iraq. And while he was doing that, he said they would hunker down as different groups were fighting each other outside the police station. So it's a challenging environment. It's a challenging situation. And it's one that the SAR addresses in terms of how do we make sure that we have a holistic approach that includes all those different elements as we move forward. And it's a big if, I think, personally thinking, is if we do that again. So,
If I could make just one
Yeah.
quick point, because I appreciate your point. Wish we had more time to dig into it. But one thing, again, adding a bit more complexity to it, is I just would want to also raise what I think is interesting and deserves more discussion. And that is, and I spoke about it a little bit last night, and that was this idea of wicked problems. And one of the things we see today is that most of our approaches to dealing with conflict, whether they be conflict prevention, conflict mitigation, conflict transformation, are anchored to greed and grievance thinking. And I think you mentioned whether it's water or food or resource distribution. And these this is what most of our literature addresses. Now, one thing we have to recognize is we've been incredibly successful in raising people out of poverty and in using less land to feed more people, and we just had a great deal of success. The UN Development Goals have been out there to guide our efforts, and I think we need to recognize that we've had some good success there. Not good enough, a lot more to do, but certainly moving in the right direction. While that's been happening, what we have seen is that fewer and fewer conflicts are anchored to greed and grievance thinking, and they're much more ethno-political and ethno-territorial. And they have taken on an identity component that we're not prepared, nor do we have any idea how to work with. We know how to make more arable land. We know how to dig more water wells. We know how to get more people off of living $1 or $2 a day. We've been successful in moving in that direction. At the same time, simultaneously, this new ethno-political, ethno-territorial conflict has manifested itself based on identity, people moving into their ethnic backgrounds, and creating a more balkanized kind of world to deal with. So we're grappling with that right now. How do we balance greed and grievance? It's taking this way and ethno-political, ethno-territorial lines out.
I would just add to that, the ethnic disputes that are arising and what we're seeing even in America itself are born out of economic frustration, oftentimes insecurity and things of that nature. So again, they don't emerge out of nothing. They do come from a particular concrete grievance in something. They happen to bind themselves to an ethnic issue or a religious issue or something else as a means of identification, but that's not the reason that occurs.
Yeah, and some people subscribe to that, absolutely.
did you have a question?
No, just, it's kind of a comment and a question back to the panel on your thoughts. You know, we talked a lot, yesterday and this evening, we were grappling with how do you define peace, how do you define conflict. But it seems to me, maybe even a greater problem is how do you define defense and how do you define security? And we've seen, you know, now they use in terms like human security, etc. But you look at NATO, a collective defense organization, it's predicated on a military hierarchy and structure. And the first thought is use of military force or use of military forces. But that's an incomplete package to achieve security. So how do you grapple with that and reframe it? You know, and I was thinking on the UN side, we send peacekeeping elements. A peacekeeping element looks a lot different than a peacemaking element. Because a peacemaking element has all the other components that address security on a broader scale. So just kind of food for thought for the group interested.
Well, I think NATO, and I appreciate it, Jerry. I think NATO is looking at that today. Certainly, people I've been in contact with from Poland would be looking at this, and because really looking at the whole NATO structure and how it's built, because now total defense is really taking primary now. And it's this idea and it's going to, again, this is going to be a generational shift. Because how do we now bring civilians more into the collective defense? And so it's not so much that our defense is provided from the outside, and Yvonne has written about this as well, as militaries as not only providers of defense, but they're also the recipients of defense. Same with civilians. And Ukraine is giving us sort of a laboratory where we can begin to see where modern warfare is headed and how the civil society is fully integrated into the defense of Ukraine. This is also now causing us to look at, well, back to the prevention and the preparation, we're looking at, gee, the importance of hunting clubs, of the Boys and Girl Scouts, of all these types of collective activities that prepare people to contribute and participate in their own defense by giving them some skills, by giving them building collective capacities to work together and do these different types of things. So if they are threatened, we learned after Katrina that the first responders weren't the police or the fire or the National Guard, they were the neighbor. And so we saw that first responders are the people who are on the ground and the neighbors, and we're trying to transfer that thinking into civil-military interaction, because the first offenders are the citizens on the ground. And so we have to have them prepared and ready to take that first brunt and then stay part of the fight, if that makes any sense. And these are all things, I mean, it's about like nailing jello to the walls. We're learning it. This is one of the important parts that NATO has to deal with, any organization has to deal with, is how to change our thinking rapidly. We were talking today about how, throw the map on top of the Humvee and work it out, because that's how quick we're going to have to be doing these things. And Ukraine's teaching us that.
Yeah, I think there's some interesting pieces there, Scott, like what your mom said about resiliency.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how does that contribute to resiliency in a country?
Yeah.
I think that an important point there is that you talk about NATO as a military hierarchy that still has the civilian apparatus at the top that controls it based on political will of the member states. So the military is just the action arm of NATO. But what you're implying is that it doesn't have all the other stabilization functions or a State Department, USAID, World Health Organization, all these other players that if NATO takes action, how does it then take care of civil society and governance?
Yeah, that's integrated. And I would argue that when people think of NATO, they think of military forces.
Right.
Whereas,
but with peacekeeping, and Scott's going to give me the hook here.
No, I have a question.
But with peacekeeping, so a peacekeeping mission is actually run by a civilian. So there's a special representative of the Secretary General who has responsibility for integrating all the facets of the UN. So where NATO primarily has the military, the UN has the ability to leverage other resources as it's assessing the situation. And so where the peacekeeping, the military peacekeeping is providing a safe and secure environment, they also have their other development and sustainment elements that can come in and assist the government with different forms of reforms that are happening in that country. So it's probably more, and Lisa, you may, I know I'm painting a rosy picture here, but in intent, that's how it should all work.
No, well, yes, so we'll go to Scott's question, but no, I think that there are distinctions there, the way those missions are led, and I guess the way they're achieving their objectives there, and I think that is a really unique aspect to the way that the UN goes about its activities, is that civilian leading in guiding all those missions are conducted.
Scott?
Yeah, I'd like to piggyback on the two comments that were made, the two questions. One of the goals of the symposium is sustained discussion. It will not end tonight. And in fact, the question I'll pose tonight probably cannot be answered by the panel, but I please give the staff. So I'm going to rely on for the sake of the audience, to rely on the panelists to try to discern what I'm asking or stating. So I subscribe to the premise that the natural course of nature is toward peace and creation. And it's the utility of force, whether that force is going to move the confrontation or conflict toward peace or more violence and force. We clearly failed over the last 20 years. And so what is in front of us here in the panel, the commonality is this use of force. Each organization, U.S. Department of Defense, UN, African Union, NATO, et cetera, there's a commonality there, and that's the use of force to solve conflict. So are we at a time now where we have, this is the question part, is this really a failure of the moral imagination to solve conflict, to allow confrontation, to allow disputes to become confrontational, and then confrontation to become conflict? And the example is Ukraine. We failed to resolve at the confrontational level and allowed it to go into conflict. And the force is not having utility because when we escalate, as the U.S. and the Ukrainian and the allies supplying lethal and non-lethal means, the Russians escalate. And we have created a war of attrition. And who is suffering? It's the Ukrainian people. I mean, is this really a failure of the moral imagination? And the other question that I don't think can be answered tonight, which will be answered in a future session in focus area, I think someone wrote a book 20 some odd years ago, The Religion, the Missing Aspect of Statecraft. And so to me, we talked about bottom-up peacekeeping, peacemaking, peace building yesterday, today top-down, and perhaps religion works both ways. And so again, is there a failure here in the moral authority of the church, regardless of faith? For instance, what we're seeing Archbishop Kirill in Russia, who is actually a proponent of the level of force and violence that the Russian government is using against the Ukrainian people. So I throw that out there. You can always defer to the next session, but
I appreciate that. I appreciate the observation on religion, because religion can and should play a key role. We talk in multi-track diplomacy, religion sort of ranked as a 1.5, and it has pathways into formal diplomatic channels as well as more grassroots ones. So I think there's a lot more that can be done, again, irrespective of faith tradition. Religion can play a key role. I just want to speak to the point about peace, and I too believe that peace is the default condition within the human domain. I'm not a subscriber to this idea that conflict is natural and normal and understood. I think it's not. I believe the archaeological and anthropological record is clear on this. As a species, we're pretty much soft on the inside and crunchy on the outside. And we could not have made it as a species to where we're at today if we did not cooperate and collaborate amongst ourselves for our collective defense, because we are simply prey to everything out there on the savannah. And so this is a unique ability of human beings to work together for what we can characterize as the common good. So I do believe that we do naturally want to assist each other. We do naturally want to live in peace-centered environments. And it's, I think, also one of the reasons that we take so seriously these ideas of conflict resolution, transformation, mitigation, because we are, in fact, trying to reestablish what I believe is that default condition. Now, are we very effective at it? Are we very good at it? Is there a lot more to do? Those are certainly all questions that are open as well. But I don't think there can be any question that that's certainly the direction human beings naturally move.
If I may jump on the first question, the failure of moral imagination, I think it's an important question. Maybe I will say not really a failure of moral imagination, but I might pick up two things. First is the failure of moral consideration, to the extent that when we think of security today, we think of politics. We have separated that humanity from this thing called institution and politics. So if you're trying to talk sense, they'll say this does not work in politics. This common sense doesn't fit in this narrative of security, of peace. So we have already a formula for peace, formula for security, and within that formula, in modern terms, moral values are not really connected to what we do. So I think maybe one of the things to go back to is to say, when, for instance, we teach peace, we teach security, we should say, when you shoot and kill, you are killing a human. You are not just shooting on a target. So that simple thing will, I guess, at some point bring a sense of humanity and morality in the way we reflect and we build our idea of security, idea of living together, a collective security, living together as human beings. I think last night Jay mentioned an important thing, say, for instance, when I deal with my family, that's family dynamic. It's I deal with my brothers and sisters, and yet we may get in the level of not agreeing on certain things, but we're still a family. That moral argument, bringing back into the construct of politics and system, is critical. Maybe the last thing I want to mention here, I think it's also the idea of being comfortable trying what we have not tried yet. That we all are facing as challenge. We know what it means to deploy people, and it's easy to do peacekeeping. It's easy to do offensive actions, all those kind of things, and we feel more comfortable in repeating what we feel being part of our doctrine, our imagination. The other aspect, the unknown, what if we do this? Well, we never tried it before, and then if we fail, then it will be a blame on us because we knew what we tried at first, and now we're trying to get into the uncharted territory, and it's not comfortable. I think as human beings and as a security sector system, when we talk about civil sector reform, as a larger aspect as well, is maybe trying something new and being comfortable in failing in that new space. And that's how we grow. We try, we fail. If we succeed, that's fine. If it doesn't work, at least we know we get comfortable in moving away from what we have established as a box of security providing and peace building. That's how I would think about this question.
Two very quick comments, which are not going to do justice to your question, Scott. The first on the use of force, I think one of the things that the UN peacekeeping missions have really struggled with is the sense that force is only meant to be used in those contexts in self-defence or defence of the mandate, so largely to protect the civilian population. And the struggle there has been, as a body, that has not been the traditional construct of the way that militaries have necessarily approached things, this idea that you proactively use force to protect the civilian population as opposed to going into battle. So that has been something that I think that the UN has really had to grapple with and has made significant strides over the last decade in particular. It's certainly not perfect at it, but I think that's an interesting construct to look at the way that force has been applied in that context. There's a lot of other challenges around that and what trouble that gets peacekeepers into, but we'll save that for tonight. But on your second question, I think more broadly about war, about what we've seen in Ukraine, I think one challenge is, that only a very small part of the population today, compared to maybe 70 or 80 years ago, is actually exposed to what conflict looks like or what war looks like. We may see things on our mobile phones, but that's vastly different to experiencing it on the ground and the consequences of that. And I think there is a tendency to talk about war as this abstract idea almost when we talk about ratcheting up conflict and the consequences of that. And I do, on a more personal note, history, civics education, discussions like this I think are so critical to ensuring that people understand the gravity and the consequences of what that means for people and civilians on the ground. So I think there's a long way to go there, but I think if you start to erode those conversations, then you are going to have a much more difficult conversation when it comes to the way that we look at defence and security and warfare.
Wow. So some good comments there, and I will have to say that I do disagree on a couple levels. The first is that Now, I don't see our or the UN efforts as a failure with Ukraine and Russia. And the reason I say that is because you have a superpower, a nuclear power with a large army that is really going to make independent decisions in its own interest. And I think that we took it to the level we could take it to. I think the UN, NATO, everybody that was trying to diffuse that from the perspective of the organizations that we're talking about in the United States, that we made those efforts, but there's a certain point where there's no more you can do in terms of trying to avoid the conflict. And then it becomes mitigate, resolve, reduce, eliminate, transformation, try to get rid of, to overcome the conflict. And that's where right now, and I'm not sure what is happening behind the scenes, but I think that's where the effort should be right now, is how do we resolve it now that it's happening? The other thing too is I'm a spiritual person, a man of faith, but I'll be the first to say that through centuries, religion has been at the center of conflict. So to say that we lack moral imagination, or that the church, the Russian Orthodox Church, should be doing more, I think from the perspective of a non-Russian Orthodox person, to make that indictment of the church, I think it's unfair, because just about every religion can be turned back on them at a certain period in time. And I think as a country with individual freedoms, where we value our individual freedoms and our right to religion or no religion, it's hard to indict somebody based on their faith. So is it faith that's making them make those decisions? Probably not. Is it faith that should be guiding those decisions? Probably. But to say that the church is failing, I don't think that we're in a position to say that. So I think that we have to, you take it back out into what is it? It's a political endeavor. War is an extension of politics, going back to Clausewitz that you mentioned last night. And so where does the church fit in there? That's a huge philosophical question. It's a good question. But I think the last thing I'll say is, we talk about the suffering of the Ukrainian people, and there's no doubt they are suffering. But I also want to applaud their resilience, that if anything else, they have shown to be a people that can adapt to their situation, that are trying to make their lives the best they can, and to defend what they believe in. So couple of counterpoints, I guess, but just my perspective. And I think on that, I will turn it over to Bill Flavin to wrap us up.
Let's have a great big hand of applause for this. Panel members for devoting their time and efforts to come here and to share their knowledge with us. I'm sure that they will leave some pearls of wisdom. They definitely have outlined challenges and opportunities, and those challenges and opportunities is something that we will explore in much further depth as we go forward with our process of the War, Peace, and Justice project. And I think Scott will take over here for a second and lead us to our next adventure.
Thank you, Bill, and again, a great job for the panels. This is exactly what we expected, and this is what we hope for the next several months, to take the entire, this is a community project. And we're gifted with incredible partners, Dickinson College, Penn State, Dickinson Law, the Cumberland County Historical Society, which is hosting us tonight in this wonderful room, the Association of the U.S. Army, the Carlisle Chamber of Commerce, the Joint Civil Military Education or Interaction, from which Tom represents, participating organizations, U.S. Army War College and the U.S. Peacekeeping and Stability Operations Institute. I think the show of support there is indicative of we do want to solve conflict and bring it to a peaceful end, but with justice. And Tom talked about a negative and a positive peace. I think the ultimate goal is to have a positive peace, that peace with justice, but it's difficult. And I think what we talked about tonight and what we talked about for the last 2 weeks with our previous sessions and with many sessions ahead of us, we want the American people to partake in this discussion, to understand the nature of war and its complexity, and then talk about the consequences of war, so we can better understand the interrelationships between war, peace, and justice. And I think those questions have to be asked: what is war, what is peace, and what is justice? Just as we asked tonight, what is conflict? Until we can come to grips with those terms, to build institutions to deal with that effectively and to save lives, which I think is the ultimate goal. And as Aristotle said, what's the purpose of war? It's to achieve a better peace with justice. I'm not sure we're attaining that. So again, please join us on this journey. We're not sure where it's going to end, but we just want it to be a discussion with the American people. And one of the takeaways on the information card that we passed out is in the back of the room. The question is, what do you as the American people expect from the expenditure of national treasure and blood? We should have a voice in that, and there's an expectation there, and it's certainly not, we don't expect failure. To have our sons and daughters come home broken or worse. And so I think we owe this discussion to look at the last 20 years and also look at future conflict and ongoing conflict, and we're going to do that in the next several months. So again, I want to thank especially our audience who participated tonight. Please come back and join us for our October events, and we'll be advertising those shortly in the next week on our website. But again, thank you for everyone partaking in tonight. God bless everyone. Thank you.
Well done. Probably won't see you again, but we'll be in touch. Oh, absolutely.